It's my privilege now to introduce to you the guests here on our panel. So first, here to my immediate left, your right, we have Zakiya Smith-Ellis. Zakiya is New Jersey's Secretary of Higher Education. Prior to her appointment in March of this year, she has worked in positions at the Lumina Foundation and on the White House Domestic Policy Council, where she helped develop higher education policy for President Obama. Next down the line, we have Beth Akers. Beth is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and has conducted extensive research on student lending policy and college affordability. She is a co-author on the book Game of Loans, The Rhetoric and Reality of Student Loan Debt, released in 2016. Next down the line, we have Martha Cantor. Martha Cantor is the executive director of the College Promise Campaign, an initiative of Civic Nation, a nonprofit focused on sensible solutions to public policy challenges. She previously served as the U.S. Undersecretary of Education from 2009 to 2013 during the Obama administration, where she primarily focused on post-secondary policy and regulation. Next, we have Robert Kelchin. He is Assistant Professor of Higher Education at Seton Hall University. His research specializes in higher education finance, accountability, and evaluation, and just earlier this year, he recently published a book, Higher Education Accountability. And of course, we have Doug at the very end. So why don't we go to opening questions? First, to you, Zakiya. You've spent much of your career developing policy ideas around college, particularly access to college. In your view, do college programs offer the best chance at promoting college access, and how does this mesh with the new free college, community college program in New Jersey, the Innovation Challenge?
Well, thank you for having me here, and the research shared today is really interesting. In addition to the several reports that have come out recently, kind of looking at free college programs. And as Doug mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different ways that you could do this. Free college in one place is not free college in another place. In New Jersey, we're doing a statewide community college initiative, so it's focused on making tuition and fees free at community colleges for students making less than $45,000, students and their families coming from families from less than $45,000. And I think the interesting thing about all of these programs, which kind of Doug alluded to in his kind of literature review, is that we've known for some number of years, people have done lots of research on college affordability, and the same themes continue to come up, which is that you have to make it clear and transparent to students about what the benefit is. So the system of financial aid, where you find out after you applied to college what you're eligible for, and then after you've already kind of reduced your solution set or decided that college wasn't for you, only then do you find out how much you get. That is not effective. It's not the most efficient way, and anything that you can do to provide clearer message to students and to families about what their costs and their benefits are going to be from college, the better. You see more people going to college in addition to reduced costs. So that we know. So I think to the extent that Promise programs are a way to cut through that noise and to provide that kind of clear message to students, then they have tremendous potential. And I think we saw in the presidential election and just in some of the past things over the last few years, how much energy is coming from just the message of free. And I think now the challenge is upon us as people involved in the higher education community, and particularly policymakers, to make good on the promises, to actually develop and design the programs in a way that's going to provide a benefit to those that need it most. And there are pros and cons to different approaches. So we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I think to answer the question, I think there's tremendous potential in the messaging value of this to cut through that noise in a way that easy FAFSA doesn't do, in a way that trying to think of some of the other things that we've tried over the past years, some of which I've been involved in. But this really has the potential to just say, hey, if you go to community college, and I'm just use our state, if you go to community college, you make less than this amount, you won't have to pay for tuition and fees, period, point blank. And then we can move on to other things that we know are important, like supporting student needs in broader ways.
Excellent. Thank you, Zakiya. Beth, to you, you have voiced skepticism about New York's Excelsior Scholarship, which is their free college program. You've criticized a number of design features there. As policymakers think about implementing free college regimes, are there design pitfalls that you would flag here?
Sure. So it's never fun to be the person in the room who's arguing against giving away something for free, but I will be the martyr and do that today for the sake of the panel. So the thing that I'm concerned about is that this idea of free is really sexy, right? And that's also the advantage of it. But I don't want to lose sight of using an economic lens to think about whether or not this is actually efficient spending. And I think that's what's often missing from that conversation. So it has come up in Doug's presentation and various places as well. I don't think it's necessarily universally neglected, but the notion that free often can become a regressive program. When there are income limits, it helps, but we still do see that it's more well-off students who are going to college. They're benefiting from the scholarship more than the less well-off students who don't go to college at all. Less well-off students tend to have more aid to begin with because of the existing programs. So filling in to make things free now tends to mean that it's the more well-off students, again, in the eligible population who are getting the additional resources. So regressivity is a concern, maybe a necessary evil of making this happen, but something to consider. We also don't want to forget that there are barriers to enrollment beyond tuition. So we know that it may not be just the price of paying to sit in your seat that's keeping people from going to college. These scholarships aren't paying to put gas in the car or food on the table for the families of these students. And maybe that's a better place to spend some of these resources than supporting tuition expenditures for families of students who would have gone to college anyway. And then the last I'll say, and then we can talk about this more in the discussion, but with these things in mind, it's sort of trying to create a policy that threads the needle, right? So we're trying to both maintain the sexy idea of free because that creates that momentum, the cultural shift around going to college, but also not create more complexity, right? And so I think that the ultimate calculation of what's an efficient policy is difficult because we can't strictly use this economic lens that says where's the most efficient spending for that next dollar. It needs to be a balance between that and this unmeasurable concept of how to create this momentum of college going for students and really have a movement here.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Next to Martha. Martha, your prior work in the federal government has provided you, I'm sure, a unique perspective on how these college programs might work. What can the role of the federal government be here, and how might it work on some kind of federal level, or should this be better left to states, and how do you see that moving forward?
Well, what's happened in the last just 3 years since we started the College Promise campaign is that when I was at NYU, after recovering from 5 years in government, almost 5 years, I looked at student savings, college affordability, financial aid, sort of the whole college affordability bucket. I looked at incentives and interventions, and I looked at promise programs at that time. So you heard a lot about Kalamazoo. It's a whole community approach, and I think that's one of the benefits and something that we really need to think about at the federal level. How do you engage the entire community in making change and really focus on the students that are highest need? Because if they do that, then the community is going to be safer. Students will have more equitable opportunities for good jobs. They'll be ready, more prepared. And they'll also, in the big picture of government, reduce the reliance on subsidies. Because if you look at a lot of the research over time, looking at students that graduate from college are not only delivering more dollars through their taxes and more dollars for their incomes, but they're also happier and healthier. And we don't talk about the other kind of social benefits coupled with the economic benefits. Most of the conversation and policy is about the economy, and is this going to change the economic future of the country because we'll have a more prosperous society. But frankly, when I think about the opportunities for the federal government, and I look at, in California, having spent 35 years there, the money that we put into the prison system, if we had put it into prevention, every one of those gorgeous prisons could have been a high school, an elementary school, a university. But instead, this is what we've learned over the last 30 years. So I think government can do things that they have already done better. So one thing that government can do, and this is my pipe dream, I guess, for the Social Security Administration, every one of us gets a letter. and we see what we've earned and what we're going to earn after we, quote, retire. Why can't we do that for Pell Grants? You know, I know Senator Alexander tried to do the 2-question Pell, but when you think of the complexity of filling out the form and getting the income too late to make the decisions, the rewards from the campuses about how much aid you're going to get, you get that in the spring. If you look at especially the lower half of our student population, our family population, your income isn't going to change dramatically. If it does, I think we've got lawyers that are smart enough to put in language in simplifying that Pell Grant so that we can get back to what Doug says. You know, the performance requirements are getting in the way. The idea of a 2.5 for a student that's 2.0 in that example that Doug gave, can't we do something? Can't we do an intervention? Can't we do better counseling? Can't we figure out, especially with how smart we've become over the last 2 decades, 3 decades, how to give those interventions to students when they most need them, instead of just saying they're not eligible. So I think Promise programs have a lot to learn. I'm thrilled, you know, that the conversation is about good policy, good design. I think the government can incentivize the best of what's happening locally and statewide. So for the Promise programs, when I looked at this at NYU at about 53, there are over 200 now. They're all different. There's no perfect promise. And I think that's the opportunity for the design features to say, can we do something like Governor Haslam's done in Tennessee, actually create an endowment and have the money earning some interest to go back to serve more students? Can we do something like Kalamazoo, where it's a whole community approach? Can we do something like Detroit, where the Chamber of Commerce put a stake in the ground and they are leading the Detroit Promise, and they are not going to stop until they look at the kinds of designs that will be better. So those are just a few of the things, and I think the government can incentivize that, certainly by providing incentive funding, matching funds, simplification, and a host of other things that I hope we'll see in my lifetime.
Excellent. Thank you, Martha. And now to Robert, one of the common critiques of making college free for students is that it could potentially lower quality, as non-paying customers have less leverage to hold their institutions accountable. From your perspective, how might free college programs change how policymakers and the public think about holding accountability, holding our colleges to account for their funds that they receive?
Sure. I'm not as concerned about the idea that students don't have skin in the game if they're not directly paying tuition. First, because if you're a community college student right now and you're low to middle income, your Pell Grant probably already covers your tuition unless you're in a very expensive tuition state. That means that we already have a lot of students who, quote unquote, don't have skin in the game, but in reality, they have quite a bit of skin in the game. That they may still have to cover fees, they have to pay for their books, and they have to go through the often emotional pain and suffering of sitting through college classes. and I mean,
Spoken like a college professor.
yeah, and I sat through a couple of your classes, Doug.
Ooh, you're waiting for that one.
I'm waiting 10 years for that one. But it is important to note that students have substantial skin in the game, even if they're not directly paying tuition. And when a student goes and complains to a college, complains to the legislature, they're not usually looking up that student's file and seeing, oh, she's directly paying tuition or not. It's also worth noting that most colleges in this country, particularly public colleges, are driven largely by enrollment, and that they're not rejecting large numbers of students. Community colleges in particular often are funded based on enrollment. So even if the student is not directly paying tuition, the college is still getting that tuition revenue from whichever source they're getting it from, and they're getting some money from the state government to help fund their operations. Now, in terms of educational quality, there are some concerns that if these programs are effective and they increase enrollment, there are these concerns that quality may suffer because colleges may get overloaded. And I think that's a reasonable concern to think about. And it's also important to note for many of these free college programs, just like state financial aid programs, they have limited budgets. Tennessee is an outlier in that they have stable endowment support. Otherwise, state free college programs tend to be like state financial aid programs. They have a budget, and they try to figure a way to accommodate students within that budget, and it may just be first come, first served, which has significant implications for equity as well. And another piece on the state funding side that's worth noting, the growth of state performance funding may have some concerns for college promise programs and free college programs that are designed to incentivize low-income students. Because if the state funding formula is not set up in a way to encourage colleges to enroll and help lower-income students succeed, these colleges may not want to recruit students if that hurts them on the funding end, even if students are not paying tuition.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. And now to Doug, you have a chance to do a rebuttal to Robert Zinger, but
You can count on it.
but Doug, were you surprised by the results of this new study? It has a 10-year incubation, and at the end of it, perhaps less than stellar outcomes. But what did you learn?
So first, the rebuttal. So you've done really well for yourself.
I've learned from great people.
So suffering was part of the process.
Yes.
So on being surprised, whether I'm surprised or not. So yes and no, I think. Going into it, I think we thought we would see some effect on enrollment, and I think especially on graduation, and the graduation effects are starting to emerge. I think going back to the beginning, we didn't anticipate how long it would take for students to get the money, right? So we thought that they would probably get official word and it would show up in the aid package in the summer. That was the original plan, and things didn't go as expected. And that part would have been hard to anticipate. We knew that the performance requirements were going to keep the effect down somewhat. I didn't mention it, but the average GPA in Milwaukee was a 1.8 in ninth grade. Right? So the vast majority of the students weren't near that bar. They were far below that bar, and we knew it was going to be hard. We knew the percentages from prior cohorts was pretty low, meeting the requirements. But there was some insistence on having a requirement, and so we went along with that, and it did keep down the effect somewhat. The other thing we didn't know at the time, so a lot of this is hindsight is 2020. We didn't know 10 years ago what the effect in Pittsburgh was going to be. They were just getting started at that point. There was no evidence on that. So I think now that we have a chance to compare our results to others, it actually makes more sense. I think what we're seeing. So Pittsburgh again, it was a 5 percentage point effect on enrollment. So we knew it would be smaller than that. In retrospect, it would be smaller. We just didn't know how much and what additional things might go wrong in the process. Again, the results they're not terrible, right? So there are positive effects, so I think that it's something to build on. And part of the goal here was just to understand how and why. We knew the effect would be smaller, but it was still worth doing the study to figure out what effects these design features would have.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Doug. So now I'm going to just put a question to the general panel, and for those who want to weigh in, please feel free to. If you had a certain amount of money to spend on making college affordable, but it wasn't enough money to make college free for everyone, how would you target the funds? Would you go for first 2 years? Would you go for low income students? Would you go for high performance thresholds like minimum GPA, et cetera? Anybody who wants to weigh in on how to best target the funds here?
Well, I'll make a comment because we just developed a program. I mean, we were looking to the governor had a commitment and made a statement to people that voted for him about free community college, and we clearly had a perspective on that. But I will say, we didn't have unlimited funds. It wasn't like, so sometimes it's a little frustrating because as a policy wonk and somebody that studied the research, you absolutely know that the best possible thing would be to make a guaranteed financial commitment to students, especially low-income students, that they will not have to pay for tuition and fees. Just for context, median family income in New Jersey is well over $70,000. So when you say a program for people under $45,000, I went to college in Nashville, Tennessee. That might be median income in Nashville, Tennessee. It might be middle income in Nashville, Tennessee. It is not middle income almost anywhere in the state of New Jersey. So $45,000, when I went to the legislature, people were like, who's going to get that? Who makes $45,000? I mean, it was like, aren't they already getting it for free? And when we looked at the data, actually, if they were already getting it for free, the program wouldn't cost any money. right? So if it was the case that everybody who makes under that amount already is covered by Pell, already is covered by, we have one of the most generous need-based financial aid programs in the nation, and we get a lot of praise for that. We spend, $400 million a year on additional student aid in addition to Pell. But it's still, even with all of that investment, we have not figured out how to knit the programs together in a way to make a clear statement to some of the lowest income people in our state that you don't have to pay for community college, which is supposed to be open access. There's one serving every county in the state. I mean, that is crazy to me. So, sorry, that was my little rant that I have on just, how but the implementation being really, really important, and some of these critiques and concerns, which I think are valid, we're not, even though we have all of these commitments already, we're not knitting them in a way together to even tell people that we think should be already getting it for free that they can go for free. And so that is frustrating, and we should fix that if we can. Second point, we don't have unlimited funds. Like, I would love to do this for everyone, or maybe everyone that we think deserves it, and we should figure out who we think deserves it and who we think doesn't deserve it and who really is low income or whatever. And, not have any, then also have a food pantry and make sure that we have housing for everyone and make sure, but I do want us to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this case. So we had, $50 million that we were willing to commit, which is, I would say, more than most other states, definitely more than other states that are similarly sized were willing to commit to their initial promise programs. We ended up getting $25 million, and with that $25 million, in terms of all of the trade-offs, so do you cut people out by GPA? Do you cut people out by saying that it can only be recent high school graduates? Those are the policy decisions that you have to weigh when you have limited funds. Some way you have to limit the number of people, or you could just say you're going to do something else. So I'm a little bit cheating because we were within the confines of we're trying to figure out how to develop a free college program and having to deal with the different things. And where we ended up, I'm very proud of. We have, something that serves both full-time and part-time students, both traditional age students and adults, many of whom would really benefit. We have, so many hundreds of thousands of people in the state of New Jersey who started college but never finished. They demonstrated at some point that they thought post-secondary education was for them, but for one reason or another, they were not able to complete. They're working adults. They're likely, within that income threshold, because we know if you don't have a post-secondary education, you're not likely to make too much as an adult. So in any case, we were able to get in on kind of all of those different. We don't have an explicit GPA requirement, which was something that was discussed in the legislature at least. And the way we mostly did it was by having this income threshold. Now, the other kind of big caveat was that was what the governor proposed, and then there's the reality of the sausage making and going through the legislature. And so after that process, though, the legislature gave us half of what we asked for, and so now we're doing a pilot program where we ask the community colleges to apply. We're still going to have the same parameters, and we'll be able to serve fewer people, but hopefully after kind of being able to be more thoughtful and through a pilot, we'll be able to refine it more and maybe even make the case better next year to get the fuller request to actually do what we initially sought out to do.
Okay, thanks, Zakiya. Beth, you want to pile on?
So just, you mentioned the possibility of shifting some of the grant funding towards the beginning of the student's academic career. And I actually think that's worth talking a lot more about. If we think about what's happening and where are the problems in student debt, we see that there's a lot of students who are starting college, dropping out pretty quickly, ending up with a pretty small loan balance, but then defaulting on that debt. So it seems that starting college is a pretty risky activity. So I wouldn't be opposed to taking those resources that are maybe now bailing out these defaulted students and putting them into grants and giving people a chance to explore the option of college, maybe not choose to continue, but not have these problematic debts to take with them as they leave.
Mm-hmm. Great suggestion. Doug, you mentioned in the slide that there are other, perhaps better alternatives for free college programs. I'm curious to have you explain a little bit what you think they might be in the context of this question. If you don't have unlimited funds, how do you best target college-going behavior and persistence and those kinds of outcomes?
No, that's a great question. I think I think there's probably pretty good agreement that we want to target the funds to disadvantaged students generally, and I think the challenge is that since you've got any additional program on top of the existing aid structure is going to tend to target it towards higher income, right? Just because of the way the existing aid structure is set up. So I think come back to the performance requirements. That's essentially flipping it, right? Then you're actually targeting it to higher income directly, and so that's again, I think that's something to avoid. But then there's a question of whether you set a requirement or set a threshold, like families below a certain income level, that this is who it applies to. So that may be one compromise position that saves a lot of money, right? So then you're not giving a high proportion of the funds to higher income families, but still keeps it simple enough that the lower and middle class families understand that they're going to have those funds eligible, or be eligible to use them. The other consideration is 2 versus 4 year college, and I think that one's a lot trickier. I think in some places, there's a heavy need, let's say, for middle skill jobs, and the middle skill jobs tend to be workers who need 2-year degrees or certificate type positions. In those places, targeting it to 2-year colleges probably makes more sense. But that may not be the same, and this is where I think you got to think about the diversity of places and how one program is going to have different effects in different places. So it becomes hard to generalize on a national scale, like to say that we should only be doing this in 2-year colleges, or we should only be doing it in 4-year colleges, because the circumstances are different in different places.
Mm-hmm. One of the effects that you found in your evaluation, and also has been seen in other research, is that some of these free college programs are shifting the margin of college choice, which is where you are going to enroll in school, to target those eligible institutions, and not necessarily college access. So I think that's an important dimension. And so how do we think, given that some of the institutions that are being targeted are community colleges, and they're not necessarily known for having great success in the labor market, are we unintentionally siphoning kids who may perform well in a 4-year degree, in a 4-year university, and get a college degree? Are we actually sort of putting them into programs that may not help them achieve their highest potential?
Well, I'm not sure I would say that students who go to community colleges don't succeed in the labor market. There's a smaller return than to a 4-year degree, but it's still a positive one. I think the issue that I thought you were going to bring up was the graduation rates being fairly low in community colleges, which is more of an issue, and I think that's relevant to the targeting too. So I think we have to think about whether, in the same sense that these programs could be used to catalyze high schools and to change what's going on in the high schools, I think maybe we should be thinking about ways in which the programs can actually get the graduation rates up and change what's going on in colleges themselves to improve graduation, so to make it a worthwhile, even more worthwhile investment to the states that are doing it.
Yeah, and I'd just add on to that when you look across the country at these more than 200 programs, you see different kinds of partnerships now evolving with 2- and 4-year institutions. So I think choice is a huge issue. I think Ed Trust has written a really good report on eliciting the kinds of questions we should be asking. If you had enough money, you'd certainly want to make at least the first year affordable, maybe not fully free, maybe it's free at the community college, and you add on non-college cost dollars to that. We call that Pell Plus, or last dollar plus. Not just last dollar, which is just covering tuition and fees, and then a low-income student turns around and can't afford books, which is why if you look at the Dallas County Promise, which had a 40% enrollment increase to college this fall. Now that'll probably level off some, but it's an amazing messaging treatment to get more students in that didn't think it was possible. But underneath that, they've got a food bank at every campus. They also have transportation, universal transportation, in a partnership with the mayor. And they also have at least 3, I think it might be 4 now, universities that have partnered with them to draw in students that could accelerate faster from the community college, and also guarantee funding streams so that it will be more affordable when they go on to a 4-year. So there's all kinds of relationships that are starting with these promise programs that I think also is really ripe for analysis, because I think college is not what it used to be. We've got to have a mindset in this country. It is not, the full 4 years. 7% of the country, of undergraduates, go to the high-performing Ivies and, the 4-year liberal arts. More than 80% go to the 2- and 4-year state university publics. And so if we want to serve the bulk of Americans, I think we need to target our dollars and really identify the highest performing in those. And I know, I can point to, Long Beach State, for example, they've had the Long Beach Promise for over 10 years. They've got 5 times the completion rate in freshman composition in the community college than they had 10 years ago. So there's outcomes like that that I think we're not paying enough attention to, that would really, if I had limited dollars, I'd be putting those into trying to really understand what were the features in design that are creating those kinds of changes, whether it's 2 or 4 year. And I think everyone's goal is ultimate choice for students to go to a good school. So if we can get to that point, I think we'll be doing well.
And one thing that's worth noting is if we go to more free community college, this could significantly upend the structure of financing higher education. Because the way that college works, and colleges often don't like to talk about this, is that the first and second year classes at 4-year colleges often help to subsidize classes for juniors and seniors. So if community colleges take more of those first and second year students, from the state perspective, that can be a good thing because community colleges tend to have lower costs of education, and in some cases, local taxpayers also help. But that really pressures 4-year colleges in terms of keeping their budget model, and if they're losing the first and second year students, not all community college students successfully transfer, so they may not get as many 3rd and 4th year students back, or they really need to work on developing some of the more robust transfer processes.
Can I just say about the kind of nuances of what may happen if this were to be the case, and really about you didn't use the term, but I think concern about potentially undermatching, sending students to colleges where they're less likely to be successful, or we just know as a fact that, same students go to, if your intention is to get a 4-year degree, then the likelihood of that is often higher if you start at a college that offers that credential. Having said that, and many 4-year degrees are generally, very open access, right? But the concern that I do have, and I've, voiced concerns in the past about ways that you could design free college to be progressive. And I will say again, I think we have one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive free community college program in the nation, or free college program in the nation. You could wind up like countries in South America or Europe that have tests in middle school and high school to determine if you're college ready. You don't pass the test, you can't go to college. If you do pass the test, you can go to college for free. Some of the greatest colleges you could make, you could make University of Virginia free. You could make University of Michigan free. Now, most public colleges are not that selective, but I guess the point being there are models in other countries that sometimes we like to point to as if that is a very progressive ideal. And I don't think that making some of these colleges that have low numbers of students of color, low numbers of Pell Grant students, and high admissions requirements completely free would be progressive at all. I think you would actually be redistributing wealth. And in many South American countries, I know Beth has written about this, the only place that you can go if you're a lower income person or didn't go to one of the best high schools in the nation, even though your nation's public colleges are free, the only place that you can get in are private for-profit colleges that charge you a lot of money. And so I just think that we need to be careful also. So the reason I'm a fan of free community colleges is because by nature they're open access. There's one in every community. People are likely to go to college close to home. And I think sometimes but there is a balance there. I don't want to, cut off options for students. Again, if we had unlimited funds, we would want to do this, in many places as possible. But I also just think we have to be careful about how we design programs and what our ultimate end goal is. If we had, every public 4-year flagship tuition free, would we be happier than if we had community colleges tuition free? And those are real conversations and real discussions that we need to think through. But I just want us to be careful in thinking about the other counter effects of that. So I stay, pretty grounded in that community college especially can be a good entry point. And I will just say again and again that it's not just the traditional age high school student, and that some of the most beneficial effects of these kinds of programs could be the returning adult who really isn't going to probably enroll in a 4-year residential, even if it means moving where they are, right? That's not the experience that they can afford for a number of reasons or are looking for. I will make a plug for, we have a 4-year college in New Jersey that does enroll a lot of adults called Thomas Edison State University through online programs. So that would be kind of an exception to what is generally a trend, though, about if a returning adult was trying to return, where would they go?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned private nonprofits, or excuse me, private for-profits. Let me say it that way. You were discussing them in an international, in talking about these international countries, but there are potentially competitive effects that may be happening here if we are sending more kids to public schools. Should we be worried about backlash from for-profits like Phoenix University, Strayer, those kinds, or Strayer University, those kinds of places? And is this a bad thing?
I wouldn't worry as much about the backlash from the for-profits. I would worry much more about the backlash from the less selective private nonprofits that are tuition-driven and trying just to put people in seats. Those are the ones that are politically connected and will make a lot of noise until they get something. As in the Excelsior example, they get something small in the private nonprofit sector. They're still not happy and they'd like more.
I heard from some of the for-profits that they're going after upper division and graduate programs now, that they'll let the more universally based 2 years go. So I think the for-profit institutions will go for where the profits can be most recouped or developed. Okay. You might want to weigh in on this, Beth.
I think there's another point that there's actually a growing, I guess we'll call it a higher education industry outside of the regulated marketplace for higher education. So we're seeing these boot camps come about and these college alternatives that are actually operating entirely outside of the financial aid system. And so I think that there's a sense that they're happy to exist there. And there's a lot of innovation happening there that's unregulated. There's no competition because the business model is really different, both on the organization side, but also on the individual student side. So, certainly it's going to crowd out what's happening in the private for-profit and nonprofit sector. But I think there's still room totally outside of this system to be seeing lots of interesting innovation happening.
I think Tennessee saw a shift from its for-profit sector to community colleges when they did their College Promise program, and that was one of the underlying points in their data.
Okay,
I
excellent.
also saw a debt reduction. The
just
first
now,
data I saw from the first cohort in Tennessee was a 17% reduction in student debt. So, there are those benefits, too, that we don't talk about. And we've got to have a system where we talk about, what Beth was saying and Zakia. These different benefits that are economic, but also the social benefits. I really think we need to have a better conversation about that.
I saw today, just with the Institute for College Access and Success, which does annual reports on student debt and state-by-state reports, that Tennessee also actually saw a 6% reduction in student loan debt, which is just unheard of. You usually kind of go for, who had the lowest increase or the lowest percentage increase in student loan debt. And so even though as a whole, as a nation, we're kind of up a little bit, Tennessee had a reduction in their average student loan debt, which is kind of
interesting. Well, speaking of student loan debt, Beth, you've written a book on student loan debt and the rhetoric versus reality there. If a lot of the conversation that's general, or the popular beliefs about student debt are actually wrong, does that change some of the calculus about whether free college programs are actually necessary?
Sure. So I think the rhetoric around student debt is that the first dollar of borrowing is a bad thing, right? So all debt is bad debt, and we necessarily have this universal problem of debt crushing our students and creating bad outcomes for them on the back end. What that book does is summarizes a lot of research that looks more empirically at what's happening with students when they're borrowing, but also when they're in repayment, and identifies that the sky is falling narrative is maybe somewhat inappropriate for a lot of students, and that a lot of students are borrowing, enrolling in a degree program, getting through that degree program, getting the financial and social benefits of having that degree and employment and having economic welfare afterwards, and making affordable payments on the back end. So the takeaway message from that is that, look, it's not a terrible thing if some people are paying for college, right? If that system is working for them. We know that system's not working for everyone. Not everyone is getting a rate of return that makes us an affordable proposition. We don't always know on the front end who those students are going to be. And so I think it's entirely reasonable to think about where are appropriate subsidies in the system, given that we know there are some students who are entering with a very high likelihood of not having a good outcome, but also keeping in mind the reality that for some students to pay is a fine thing. And that's going to be the reality when we think about the fact that in practical terms, we have limited funds to spend on supporting student enrollment in the first place.
And again, I would say if you look at that data on who enrolls and then has low chances of or ends up not completing it. The highest rate, it's the lower income students, the ones that we don't want to take on the debt. I mean, so I will come back to, if you are able to target within free or kind of narrow within free, it's not, and I will say there are people probably not on this panel, but maybe Martha would. I mean, there's people that argue that when you target things to low income students, even within a form of free, that you're kind of diluting the message, and that more universal access would lead to kind of middle income people getting these benefits, kind of leads to more people supporting community colleges or supporting the system of public higher education, which would lead to more support. And that universal programs rather than targeted programs end up getting more political support in the end. I'm not necessarily making that argument right now because that's not the way our program is set up, but I think that's an important perspective to raise. I think they would argue like Social Security and other being the marquee benefit that is a universal program in nature that people don't necessarily go after in the same way for being regressive, even though, if you make $1 million a year, you still get a Social Security check when you retire. It won't be, for your $1 million, but you do still get a Social Security check, and people don't seem to have angst about that. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they do, I don't know, but I haven't heard the angst about that.
Yeah, I don't think people understand what benefits, what federal benefits are. I also think in the student debt conversation, we have ignored credit card debt. Mm. And so we have focused so much of the public narrative on college debt with federal funds. I mean, personally, I think we have too many federal funds. The rates, interest rates are uneven. There's not one, I could imagine one scale, one sliding scale. And based on income, this is what you could get, and this is how much you're eligible for, and this is how your Pell Grant is tied in, and so on. Mm-hmm. But it is very complicated, and unfortunately, there are too many disincentives in the loan program that make the debt really escalate. So if you go to a bad school and you don't get a benefit, and it costs you $30,000, $20,000 a year, you're sunk. Because you don't get that job, you don't get, you can't get out of paying back, and then you go into default, and we've got the spiral down. But, as Beth said, I mean, the majority of people are paying on their loans, and I think we forget that also. So I think it's all about what Doug said at the beginning, how do we design these features, especially student aid, to be integrated, and also, a lot of the adult promise programs and the work that Lumen is investing in are braiding state and federal resources together. And that, I think, is a great opportunity for us to figure out, what can we do with the labor funds tied to the education funds. Some states are tracking the data as well, so that you can look at economic outcomes in the labor market, which are more effective, and re-incentivize the entire community and the entire state to say, yes, we have to do more of this because these are the design features that are going to really produce the outcomes that we need for this country.
Yeah.
Just want to piggyback on that real quick. So I think that's an important point you're making, Martha, because the federal-state partnership then allows for that differentiation, like for states to design it in ways that make the most sense in their circumstances.
And one concern to watch out for with tuition-free college proposals is that a number of colleges are hesitant to encourage or allow students to borrow for living expenses because they control tuition. They don't really control living expenses as much as they just set an estimate. So the concern is that students would default on their debt for living expenses, not tuition, and colleges may want to cut back on even allowing students to borrow, which could have unintended consequences as well. So if we move more toward tuition-free, I think it's worth keeping an eye on whether colleges continue to allow students to get loans for living expenses.
Let's circle back to the question that was posed. Again, one of the themes, the takeaway from that collection of work about debt was really that it's not so much the price that's the problem, even though the free college discussion is entirely about price, it's the risk that's the problem, right? So if we had a degree program that cost $100,000, but it guaranteed students the opportunities that we all think about when we think about college with 100% guarantee, we wouldn't care how much it costs, right? I mean, because in that instance, in that model that we often think and talk about, the human capital model, it's a great return, it's a good investment, and we can think of it that way. But the problem is that's not the case, right? Even if on average those things are true, we want to think about what is the variation. And the lesson for that when we think about the design of these programs and targeting the funds is where is the risk the greatest?
Beth, do you want to talk about income contingent loans on that? It seems very long.
I can, sure.
It seems very relevant to the point about risk, right?
Yeah, sure. The income-based repayment or the... Yeah, sure. I mean, so there's an existing program, income share agreements or income-based income contingent. So the federal programs. Yeah, so right now we have some mechanisms in place that I think are great in theory, less great in practice, which essentially are designed to deal with the risk that these students are facing. So when students graduate, they can optionally enroll through some unfortunately complicated paperwork in a loan repayment program that limits their monthly payments to something that is based on what their income is at that time. So students, in theory, are not going to be required to make payments in any given month or year that are unaffordable relative to their actual earnings. So this does a great job, actually, of ensuring that if people don't see those returns that we think about in the perfect model, that they are protected. Unfortunately, even though this system sounds perfect to an economist like me, who can kind of think through what the incentives are on the front end and understand the ultimate incentives for borrowing, college going, and things like that, it turns out that people don't like complexity and don't always succeed in interacting with the system in a perfect way. So despite the fact that we have these safety nets, we still see people defaulting, people who probably could have been enrolled in these programs and benefited from these programs. And so it's a back-end safety net that's really an alternative regime to the one that we're thinking about. And the calculus on whether or not that's better or worse than putting more money up front, I think, is really going to be a judgment call, because there's no math that answers that question of whether or not eliminating the complexity of this sort of system will be more efficient in the long run because of the momentum and the cultural change that happens with it.
Can I just make a plug for people who want to work in policy and in federal policy? Like, this is the kind of thing that we would work at the Department of Education. So I would argue part of the reason that we haven't still seen the impacts from this kind of program is not that yes, that people don't like complexity, but also the implementation of the program and the way our government and the servicers let people know. So when I started in 2009, we were doing nothing, literally nothing, to publicize the fact that income-based repayment exists at the federal level. There was an independent organization who had a website called ibrinfo.org, which was the main place that you could find information about income-based repayment. And one of my first tasks that Bob Shireman gave me was to talk to Federal Student Aid to figure out how we could get a PDF that we could put on the Federal Student Aid website that explained what income-based repayment is. I remember going to conferences of people that were in law school saying, hey, did you know that if you graduate from law school and you have these loans, you don't have to go to a big firm. You can get forgiveness after 10 years. And people were like, this is the first time I'm ever hearing. This was like 2009. They were like, this is the first time I'm ever hearing about this. What are you talking about? Where can I find more information? And I was like, well, we're still trying to develop the website that will have information about this. But so, I mean, this goes back to our financial aid system and all these things. The way you implement these programs, if you have free, I mean, even the program that the Milwaukee program that Doug evaluated, about the information effect and telling people about it. I mean, the free college stuff wasn't as big now as it was when they ended that program, but we're seeing this in New Jersey and starting to think about how would you, in a community, tell people about this opportunity. That was one of the requirements that we asked people to respond to as part of the pilot. How would you do that outreach? How would you reach out to students? So anyone that wants to work in policy and think about these questions, sometimes the reason why things work or doesn't work is really kind of what's the behind the scenes going on there. And right now we have a continued conversation with servicers, and are they telling people when they call and say, hey, my loan payments are not affordable, I heard about this thing, what are they putting people into, how are they explaining what goes on? And that has a lot to do with whether or not at the end of the day we see an impact. I know we saw some of the first data on public service loan forgiveness. People that are getting their loans forgiven now would have been enrolling in the program or thinking about the program at that time when we had no information online. Mm-hmm. So it does not surprise me that something like 70 people are getting loans forgiven in 2008 18, because you would have had to start taking out loans in 2007 for you to begin being available, and we were essentially not doing anything, and then only recently have there been much more kind of take up of and understanding of the messaging. So just anyone that wants to work in policy, this is like the hard work of the behind the scenes, and we need you to be involved in that.
But also the policy folks don't really think about too well about widespread communications.
Yeah.
And I think, if we're learning anything from Doug's results, it's, how do you communicate this and to who, and to which families, which students, and which practitioners in the schools, because a lot of times we'll glaze over with all this data and they won't know the basics. So is there some role for government and states to just simplify so that people can implement? If it's a mentor for every student in the country, let's do that. Let's do a call to arms in every community and do that, because we've got the research that says this matters. And can we really look at these different features, whether it's taking the funding in a promise program and putting it into an endowment, or taking an example from Tennessee, or from now Rice University yesterday is going to go up to $135,000 per family. If you get in, so they're part of that small 7%. But I think people are saying there are more talented students that could really drive the economy forward than are eligible or can get in. And part of it is the complexities that I think you both are talking about. The other last point I want to make before we go open it up, I do think we have ignored as a country the fact that, for example, in community colleges, more than 2/3 of students are working already, and they are paying taxes into the tax base. And for the state universities, I think it's more than half. So we've got people with skin in the game. You want to talk skin in the game, go backwards and see how many years these students have been working to get into where they are. And I think we ignore that opportunity to have, a working country that understands, you're going to have to get more education over time, and the adults that are coming back, as Zakiya said, are just a critical opportunity for us, in addition to the youth to college, which are the more traditional age students.
Okay, Beth, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to thank both of you for expanding on my comments a little bit, in that, I kind of pin it on complexity and say income-based repayment doesn't work because it's too complex. It's not too complex. People are smart, right? People can utilize these systems. Implementation has been a problem for this program. And I don't want to understate my support for this type of system, actually, just to reiterate the point that if instead of talking here about how free college is a sexy idea and it's a movement, we were talking about how college insurance is sexy and that's a movement, I would be more excited, okay? So I actually think that's the way to go, not to understate that point. But yeah, it needs to be done better than we're doing it today.
Okay, thank you.
It's either or. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the thing.
Right.
Thank you. So let's just do one last question, and maybe everybody can weigh in, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. My question is, let's look to the future, and where might free college be heading? Is there likely to be some kind of larger federal program in 5 to 10 years? Is there a political compromise that might be necessary in order to make this happen? What about the rise of artificial intelligence, machine learning? Is that something that we need to be thinking about in the free college equation? Where does this move forward as we try to look in the future?
Crystal ball.
I hear crickets.
I'll jump in. So I'm actually excited about the way that it is moving forward, which is in the States. Because I think that gives us, as we're talking about today, an opportunity to look at, the evidence about how different types of designs are working. And if it were the case where we did wish to, or had the political desire to implement a federal program, we'd have a lot of evidence about how to do that effectively. So that's where I think the movement is politically today, and I think that's a good thing.
Thanks, Beth.
From an audience standpoint of who do we really want to serve in this country, and the growing numbers of Latino and African American and other students from immigrant populations. The fact that we've got more than 1/3 on Pell Grants. When you look at that, at all of these students coming into higher education and students who are out of higher education that could go to career technical training, to a 2-year, to a 4-year. I just think we've got such an opportunity to simplify, as I said, the messaging, and to really focus on local communities that states could incentivize. I just think there's a huge role for this partnership because, when I look at El Dorado, Arkansas, I look at Kalamazoo, I look at Long Beach, I look at, I look at Greater Houston, I look at, any number of the Detroit or Buffalo. I think Buffalo has Say Yes to Education Buffalo. It's something that's starting at birth and going through the workforce. So and that's more than 10 years old. They've got 6 years of data. I think we need to look at how these local community designs are being implemented, and states could play a huge role, not only on the loan side and the debt side, but also on the design side to really incentivize the best of our designs so that we can have greater output. That's what we want. We want people in good jobs. We want people earning a family-sustaining wage. And we want people that are going to be community leaders and participants. We don't want, we've just got too much isolation in this country and too much division. So I think, the local promise programs are saying we've got bipartisan support. People are piling on between business, education, government, and philanthropy to say we've got to do better locally. And I think states can have a huge role there. And I think the federal government could do that role of incentivizing and stabilizing and simplifying the what, as Zaki and you have both said, Beth.
So I think the federal government probably won't do anything dramatic in the next 5 to 10 years. We may not even see Higher Education Act reauthorization until then. Who knows? But the federal government still plays an important role in generally increasing the Pell Grant, 1 or 2% a year. And states look at that. They see it's still higher than community college tuition and fees. So I think the action is probably state tuition-free community college, maybe tuition and fee-free for some states that are being a little bit nicer to students. And the concern then becomes, what types of restrictions do states put on these systems? We're seeing states put residency requirements on, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some more conservative states come up with this tuition-free idea, but say that if you don't graduate, it turns into a loan. So I get concerned about the restrictions, but given the relatively low price tag of doing this, particularly in states that locally fund community colleges, I think we'll see more states continuing to do this.
Yeah, I think it's going to expand too. If you look at the polling, actually, it's interesting how broad the support is. It's not, so Democrats are obviously much more supportive, but a plurality of Republicans support it. Tea Party Republicans support it, and it addresses several different problems at the same time, right? The debt problem that people are concerned about, the general affordability, which is tied to that, our declining attainment numbers, economic competitiveness, inequality. It addresses so many problems at once, and is popular. And some of these programs are actually not that expensive. Like it would be quote unquote affordable from a fiscal standpoint to do this. Actually, I do think probably within the next 5 or 10 years, depending on who's in Congress, of course, and who's in the White House, I think there's a good chance that there would be a federal initiative that would at least complement the state initiatives, and that the state initiatives will continue to expand.
Mm-hmm. You want to pile on, Zakia? Or?
Sure. I think you asked, what do we see happening on the horizon? I do think you'll see more action within states. There's governor's races, and this has been a topic among many of those races. I think I actually am more optimistic than Robert on the federal level. I think the last presidential election, this was a huge topic, and it's just everybody was surprised at how the outcome of the election, and so this candidate that is now president didn't have much to say about this particular topic, but almost everybody else did within the Republican and Democratic, primaries. So I think you'll continue to see this come up, and it's come up in some of the, congressional races where people are trying to be that progressive champion. I just think this is basically become a litmus test. Do you have a plan or a perspective on not only college affordability, but more specifically free college? And I think for folks that think that this is not going away or have, questions or concerns, the next step would be, okay, well, what is the alternative? Because you can't just be, we don't have an alternative, so it's college insurance or something else, but having an alternative that speaks to kind of what is really, really popular. Because I will just say, if you've never been on a campaign or had to go in front of thousands of people who have questions or answer a town hall, or if you shy away from these conversations at your, family reunion, Thanksgiving, holidays, because you don't like to talk to people about complexity, that's what politicians have to do, and that's the way our system of representative democracy works, is that people have to be able to answer you have to be able to answer people and their concerns and their pocketbook concerns. And so sometimes I think we can sit here in our nice, Brookings Institute and say, oh no, we're not going to worry about what's popular, and we know it's popular, but they're so wrong about that. No, you have to be able to explain what your idea is as an alternative to address someone's concern. And so in the next 5 years, I don't think people's concern about this is going to go away. Therefore, I think we are going to see some movement, and it's kind of up to us what that is going to look like and how it'll be shaped.
And can I just make one last point? I mean,
Sure.
Also, I think everyone in the country realizes that we have been inefficient. So we can do a lot better with what we have, in addition to doing more for the highly targeted, well evidence-based results that we're getting in communities and states. And so, in terms of really trying to figure out, for example, we have a Pell surplus, or we have, we're scrambling to get Pell dollars on the mandatory side of the budget because we've got 2/3 of a Pell grant on the discretionary side of the budget. That's crazy. Can we take a surplus, make an irrevocable trust, let it grow interest, and use it for more people? I mean, I think the economists have a huge role to play in financially stabilizing, helping us really stabilize what we have and use it better, much less, identifying targeted dollars to do even better things and more things that we need to do for our students and families.
Okay, great. Thank you, Martha. So with that, let's go to the audience. Why don't we we'll take 2 questions at a time, I guess we can pick and choose how we answer those, how we respond. And so I see a red shirt right here, and then how about this woman here in the black?
Steve Crawford, George Washington Institute of Public Policy. Greetings to some of you whom I know. You've talked a lot about the performance requirements or other restrictions on who would be eligible at the high school level, but I've heard very little about restrictions that might be imposed on continuing to have access to free community college or whatever the institution is once you are in the institution. I mean, I heard Robert talk about the possibility that some more conservative states will encourage, may require that you graduate or have to repay it as a loan. But I haven't heard anything about having to, whether it's a good idea or not, to require students who are admitted free, for example, to maintain a certain average or to major in something that will help them actually get a job after they graduate. Any thoughts on that?
Almost every college that offers financial aid has a restriction on students continuing to enroll called satisfactory academic progress. If you keep failing classes, you do not continue to get financial aid. So that is a continuous requirement, and I think a lot of the GPA requirements, like the Tennessee one, is a continuous requirement as well. It is an initial, but you have to maintain that GPA. And I know some states actually do you have to major in certain things. I will say that adds significantly to the complexity. So I talked to one person in the state who said, yeah, we have free, but only if you major in this or that. Well, a lot of students don't know prior to coming in, and the way you kind of market it, it's just difficult, but not to say, I think it has been done in some places.
Yeah. Let's go to the question with the woman in the black.
Hi. Hello. Okay. Hi. I'm Lindsay Reichland-Cruz. I'm from the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and I want to talk a little more broadly, or ask you a question a little more broadly about the implications of free college. Often there are questions about, what about non-tuition expenses? And in that vein, and also interestingly from the results of the study that was presented, what is the role of kind of broader, more holistic supportive services in the free college conversation? So for example, if we're talking a lot about adults going back to college, a lot of those adults have children. What about childcare? What about case management and coaching that can help address some of those other factors that really matter when it comes to persistence and successful completion? So is there room for that conversation in the free college movement and as it's developing? And if there's any models that are coming out that touch on those issues, I'd love to hear about them. Thank you so much.
I mean, I can jump in and just say that I don't think as a country we know that 1 out of every 4 undergraduates is a parent, and in the community colleges, 50% are parents. There are models, Monroe Community College in New York, which has free college, Excelsior, even with all its problems, has drop-in childcare, as does Los Angeles Valley College. California has free college for community colleges. These are solutions so that what families now are going to be able to afford $1,000 to $2,000 a month to put their kid in childcare. A lot of it is extended family challenges, and I think the non-tuition cost discussion that we had up here really says we need to do more, and we need to understand what the needs of these parent learners really are. And I just do want to give a plug to the Midiar Foundation, because their mindset is intergenerational, that we have to educate, as Zakiya said, the working adults to go back in, hopefully not so highly targeted to STEM that we miss out on the teacher shortages and other high need areas that we need to really address in this country. But also those non-college costs like childcare, food, transportation, housing are critical for these populations to do well, especially if you have more than one child. So I just think we need to do a lot of work there, and I think we need to have almost a tri-generational mindset. Because it's really, we want to get the working adults and the disconnected adults back into school. We want them to get a good job so that they can pay back their loans, and we want to continue to do the traditional youth to college mindset that we've had in this country for decades.
Let's go to Doug.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think we've alluded to the different kinds of costs that go into college, but I think it's important to point out that the direct costs that we usually think about, tuition and fees, is not actually the majority of the cost. The majority of the cost is actually opportunity costs, lost wages, and indirect costs in the case of living expenses and so on, especially for those going away to college. And that's worse for working families, right? Those other costs are even higher. So even for the average student, it's true that the direct costs are not the main cost. For working families, it's a lot higher. So I think we just need to keep that in mind when we're designing these programs. So even a free tuition, free and no fee program would still come with considerable cost.
Yeah, Beth?
Something just to be careful of, recognizing that these are probably some really important barriers without evidence on it for getting people to college like we'd like to see. I don't want to put too much of a burden on our system of higher education to provide social safety nets that would be better designed elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So, the problem of childcare for low-income individuals is a problem regardless of if you're enrolling in college, right? And so I appreciate that the problems may be specific to enrollment in higher education, but also would caution against trying to put too much stress on a system to do things it's really not designed or doesn't have the expertise to do.
But that's why the welfare policy, braiding those financial opportunities at the community level, so that, for example, at Los Angeles Valley College, they've got a social worker from the social services agency that's coming once, or I think it's even twice a week now, to help those families that are in great need to figure out what better solutions are being offered to them. And so I do think we have these disconnected silos of revenues that could actually, if we really figure out how to braid them together, and in the case of Los Angeles, the county came in to support the drop-in childcare, which was phenomenal.
These things aren't disconnected. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, they work better when they are, done hand in hand. So I think free college that focuses on tuition and fees has to be complemented with, the other supports in any way that you can. When we had our kickoff meeting, which Martha attended for our Community College Innovation Challenge, which is what we called our pilot process, we had our Commissioner of Human Services there to talk about how community colleges could partner with county human services to get people the services that they might be otherwise eligible for. So we see these things as totally aligned.
Oh, great.
So just one added thing, I think part of this is the college's responsibility, and I agree with Beth that having colleges become social service agencies is probably not the way to go, but just advising and counseling and connecting students on a personal level to somebody in colleges is really important. That's a clear predictor of student success. So that's still on the colleges, and it's a bigger challenge when we're trying to bring more students and a more diverse population into the schools.
Okay, let's go to a couple more questions. I see a woman in the blue and white in the back, and over here a gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi, I'm Katie Vaughn from the Cato Institute. I was wondering how these programs would help students that may not have long-term residency in states, such as like military families, families that move overseas for jobs, or low-income families that have to move state to state? And how can we make that transparent of the state requirements for these free college programs known to students before they apply?
Hi, Michael Dannenberg with Education Reform Now. My question pegs off of a finding that Robert Kelchin made in the last couple of years. Just the most striking stat I've heard in education in some time, that 50% of black borrowers approximately default on their student loans within 12 years of initial assumption, and 23% of black bachelor degree holders default on a student loan within 12 years of initial assumption. My question is, other than a universal gold-plated free college program that covers total cost of attendance, how can free college program designs either ameliorate this problem, or what kind of threat do they present in terms of worsening it?
So to take the second question, I think that income-driven repayment should, in theory, completely get rid of the risk of default. And would free college help with that? My sense is probably not that much, at least if it's tuition-free. It might reduce the amount students have to borrow somewhat, but they're likely still to have to borrow for other factors. So I think it's much more an income-driven repayment issue than a tuition-free college issue, even though it is alarming.
Can I mention that Chuck, the first question about military and transient families? I know many of the programs do have these residency requirements, but I will say, particularly for military families, there are a lot of benefits through the Department of Defense for tuition assistance. So that actually are more generous than most of these programs here. So that would probably be the way that you want to do the first thing. And it'd be interesting to see if other places decide to kind of have an exclusion to the residency if you are in the military, or probably that would be the main thing that I would see people being open to. The second piece about the African-American borrowers and defaulting within at 50% rates has been probably the most alarming statistic that I've seen in my entire career. And thinking about what we can do so that that is not an outcome, I think has to be an urgent and pressing concern. I would say I don't think free college makes it worse, for sure, So I don't know that it has the ability to solve that particular problem. I think in addition to talking about free community college or free college, we also have to talk about college quality. I think we have to talk about college supports, non-tuition supports. Like, us having this conversation doesn't preclude us from having other conversations. And I do think that, hopefully this is just an entree into other broader questions about making sure that students are likely to graduate, and making sure that what we're teaching people in college is aligned to what they need to be successful in the workplace, and that whatever systems that we have in place for student loans lead to successful repayment. Like, all of those things have to happen, and it doesn't have to be free college's responsibility to solve all of them, but we should be thinking about the totality of them, and we should be making sure that our program design doesn't make those things worse. So that would be my primary concern. Are we making the problem worse by what we're doing, even if we need to do other things to make it better?
I'll add, just in response to the second question, too, I'm a fan, as I said before, of moving resources from ex-ante aid to ex-post aid. In other words, we use Pell Grants to try to target to individuals who we think need help to get through school, or we think will go to school if we give them this aid. I'd like to see more discussion and thought put into designing ex-post safety nets, so that once we have the resolution of uncertainty, we see who it is who actually is struggling, that resources can go to them, and allow the 50% who are not defaulting to sort of pay back to support that system.
I just add in that I don't see a limited sort of mindset on Pell Grants, because I'm really encouraged by, the Wabash County promise that's starting in elementary school, telling students as, what they would like those expectations to be a college-going student broadly, whether it's career technical or more traditional as we've known it. And I think we're seeing a lot of use of incentives at younger ages, early college promise programs. I was just at A&M yesterday, Texas, and they've had an early college program, and they're going to have a lot of students coming into college that already have a lot of college credits because of dual enrollment. So I think those incentives, those financial free college type incentives, are really boosters to that. I do want to just make one comment about the first question, because I do think transparency is essential, and I can imagine in 5 to 10 years of reciprocity. And I go back to the El Dorado, Arkansas promise, where they'll send students anywhere in the country for 1 to 4 years because they have studied this for over a decade, and many, many students come back to Arkansas. They also have an adult promise that's more highly targeted, as we were saying, so I don't know which careers they might be missing because of that early onset, but I think, my takeaway from all of this is it's so ripe for continuous improvement as we move forward in this, and that's where I think all of these ideas can come to play, and we really need to use the evidence base to drive those improvements.
Okay, great. A couple more questions. This gentleman in the corduroy jacket, and in the back, a woman wearing a black blazer.
Thank you. Thanks, that works. I'm of European extraction, and I think an international study would make a great deal of sense. And I need to take 20 seconds to set up the context. I started teaching in a free university in Bucharest, Romania, in 1970. Taught for about 18 years. Studied at Hopkins in 70. After coming to this country, I taught at Hopkins in the 90s. Now I'm teaching at Maryland and American as an adjunct. And I went back to my country to teach as a visiting professor. Tremendous changes, not only cultural, but political, socioeconomic, mentality-wise, demographics. So my question would be, have you somehow, not formally, not analytically, but informally, anecdotically, tried to explain some of these things in terms of changing demographics, millennials' mentality and values, and the change in values everywhere in the world, as a matter of fact. And Michael, I think that artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is very close to my heart and a fascinating subject, needs a separate discussion. Because my dictum is cogito ergo sum. Signed, IBM Watson.
Let's go to the, black blazer.
My name is Delabian Rice Thurston. I'm writing a dissertation that looks at what it means that we do not have a fundamental right to education in the Constitution. When Bernie Sanders came up with this college for all, the first thing I thought was, hey, my God, there's a fundamental right to college when there isn't a fundamental right to K-12. When you spoke about the kids who were not prepared, they're not prepared because K-12 is not meeting their needs. In the United States, looking at national merit scores, Wyoming, West Virginia, North Dakota, Mississippi, Arkansas, South Dakota, Utah, Louisiana, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin have the dumbest smart kids in the United States. Looking at national merit best students. How can we assume that states that are doing such a terrible job with their best kids will have the resources needed to provide college for the kids who are graduating from high school? If they don't, it is going to be, I believe, a federal government responsibility. If that's the case, then under David Cole's Engines of Liberty, that what's going on in the body politic leads to changes in the Constitution or constitutional interpretations. San Antonio v. Rodriguez said there is no federal government responsibility for education. Are we on the road to getting a federal responsibility for education as the states can't come up with the money to provide college or two-year colleges for all of the students who are going to want it?
Okay, excellent question. So do we have a fundamental right to college or education in general and shifting demographic values? Beth?
Yeah, let me jump in. I'll address the second question, maybe slightly with a tangent, but anyway. One of the things I'm always surprised about with the free college conversation is that nobody points out that the cutoff between 12th and 13th grade is completely arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So we can really all get behind this idea that K through 12 education should be the social system, right? And then 13th grade, when we talk about making that free, it's like, whoa, stop the conversation. We need to talk about incentives. We need to talk about, is this the most efficient dollar of spending? And so I think that's, a fair discussion and also consistent with why I think about front-loading some of the grant aid that we are spending on higher education.
So you're for free community college, or are you for paying for
don't
high
quote
school?
me on it.
Which one are you for?
Not on tape in here.
Okay, no.
But I'll stop there.
Okay.
I'll just note the federal government provides roughly about as much money to support higher education through all their programs as the states do. I don't see a federal constitutional amendment anytime soon, but the federal role in higher education has been well ingrained for 50 years now.
And to contrast that with the level of federal investment in K-12 spending, that's about, federal investment is about 10% of total K-12 spending. So much more significant investment from the federal government there.
And we can do a whole lot better with junior, senior, freshman, sophomore year. We can just do a whole lot better, and you see a lot of that in the dual enrollment conversations. And I've been saying more recently, we should have dual enrollment in 2 to 4 year as well. Dual enrollment should be, a way that we can accelerate talent. And we don't think of it that way. So we would have more time to spend on students that need more help for all kinds of reasons, if, with a third of children not being ready for kindergarten and all the way up. So, there are a lot more solutions that we need to apply at all levels of education. But just a quick comment on your question on the international, just knowing there is a dissertation by Valerie Ballerini that compares Tennessee to Argentina. And part of what she's done is look at the cultural evolution and the history of free college in now 10 countries in the world. And how did that evolve, and what is the expectation as a whole country approach? So I read that thing, I was on her committee, and when I think of free college in a local community, and then I think of it scaling up, and I look at what Chile had done to open up when Bachelet came in and open up that single test issue to really include many more students, and then having the University of Chilean University and the Católica University study the outcomes. The outcomes were fantastic. So I think, the whole country, the whole community, the whole state approach is really a way to get back to what Doug said about, how do you simplify the messaging, and then how do you have the right kinds of designs so that we can have the kind of, evolution of this that we want to see that we used to have for some, not all.
Thank you very much. Is there a longitudinal dimension to this study?
Yeah, you can definitely, I can connect you.
Yeah, why don't we take that offline? A couple more questions. This gentleman in the tie over on the left here, and this gentleman in the khaki blazer.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Emily Dye from Cato Institute, and I have a question about adding this money to the students, giving the students this money. How will that inflate college prices on the other end? I have a concern. I'm a student at GW, and GW is really good at milking their students for a little bit of money. I hope I'm not offending anyone, but
I think that's their strategy.
It is. They're really good at finding these hidden costs, whether it's making students stay in the dorms for an extra year. So how do we combat that? Is there any program that would require there to be an upfront cost of tuition staying the same through all 4 years or all 2 years that would combat giving students money and then having the colleges try to milk that money out of them?
It's an excellent question. And to yours?
Hi, Eric Gross from American Council of Trustees and Alumni. My question is for Professor Harris. I was wondering if you could speak to the nature of parental involvement in your experiment. First of all, it's kind of a cliche at this point to note that so much of academic success starts at home, and it's difficult to control that. Second of all, from how you described the experiment, it kind of sounded like you're pitching directly to ninth graders and saying, if you keep your grades up and go to class, we'll pay college. But I think about myself at 14, 15, which is a little bit more recently than most of us here. And I definitely lack the maturity and executive function to respond to long-term incentives like that. And potentially getting parents in the picture can be a little bit better of a leveraging tool. And I was wondering what you have to say on that topic.
Yeah, so I can start with that one. So we also sent letters home to the parents to make sure that they were getting the message and encouraged parents to talk with their kids about the program. So we recognize that certainly parents are incredibly important in all of this. on the first question, somebody help me. What was the first question?
Tuition
Tuition
rising
Yeah.
as
college
Gabe,
costs.
how do you
Free
control
Oh,
the
right.
tuition part?
Well, I think the other thing important to point out here on that is if it's free, then there isn't tuition, right, in a sense anymore. So then the amount of money then that the schools have to work with is basically determined by the government at that point. So it's how much they give is how much they have to spend. If it's actually free. Now, it's possible
but what
it gets set up in a way that they can still charge fees on top of it. And you could try to regulate it, although this is where I think the design gets complicated. And you start, you do one thing and you think it's going to be simple until it triggers something like that. And then you have to start creating all these rules to try to combat it.
But what about for the middle class parents who are aren't eligible for the free college, but yet they may also see their prices rise, sort of as a
right? If only some, and this gets to the targeting, right? So we're targeting it only to certain families and so on. So so it could end up leading to some cross subsidization then. So the students who are tuition paying then may be affected by the students who are on the free college tracks.
I actually think the state-based programs have some good models that you could look at for this. So at a state, where you do actually, not in New Jersey, but in other states like Tennessee, the place that's doing the College Promise program also does set the tuition rates for the institutions. So you could think about this in a place where the same place that's talking about financial aid is also the place that looks at tuition. You would do these things hand in hand, and they're also the ones that know what the costs are to the institutions. So it's not that way in every state, and Martha and others probably know about that, but I think there's some interesting features of design, and this is one of the policy things that I think does get overlooked, but from where I sit, it's not a far-off thing. It's a very real and present concern about how you account for that over time.
So I think of two examples of states. I think of Georgia and Massachusetts. Georgia for the Hope Scholarship, Massachusetts for the Adams Scholarship. And essentially both states tried to limit tuition increases as much as possible to make the tuition-free programs really cheap. And they just hiked fees. The colleges ended up basically getting the money they wanted. So in the end, the total sticker price didn't really end up changing that much as a result of these free college programs that they had.
So I'll come back to the maturity question because I didn't answer that in my initial response. I agree with you. We see evidence of that in the results. When we look at year by year, students didn't really start to respond at all until the end, right? Until basically their senior year, which I think reflects what you're talking about. But I think part of what I think the results suggest is that free college can change what the adults are doing, not just parents, but also in the schools. Students may not have the maturity and executive function to respond in the way that we might want them to, but part of the idea here is to change what's happening more broadly, and I think this is why when you do it on a big scale, there's that potential to have a bigger effect beyond what an individual student might decide to change.
Okay, last round of questioning. This woman here in the black sweater and the gentleman here with the tie.
Hi, thank you all very much. Very illuminating. My name is Mindy Reiser. I've worked for the Department of Education, the Institute for Education Sciences, and NCS. My question is this. There are many ways to get to an interesting and rewarding job, and they're not necessarily all through community college or four-year college. So I'm wondering, to take in mind what you said earlier about artificial intelligence and a number of other ways of learning, and of course Peter Thiel, as you know, had this great idea of supporting young entrepreneurs with $100,000 to create their own businesses. So what can we do in terms of enabling people to pick and choose, let's say, coding courses, other courses that might lead to a good paying job that are not necessarily college? This afternoon, the AFL-CIO will be hosting a session on apprenticeships, and that's a model that many people are following. So the conversation here is focused on institutions called community colleges or four-year colleges, but there are other ways of enabling people to make careers that are rewarding. I'd like you to talk about that.
Okay, thank you. And go ahead.
Time is short. My name is John Swallow, and I'm a retired Foreign Service officer with USAID and worked a lot in higher education. But I expected to hear today the term remedial studies or education, and I didn't. Martha made a slight reference, but not using the term. My question is, how are they involved with free college? And it could be many angles, impediments to free college, or perhaps included remedial studies in education. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So because we're running short on time, we'll just do lightning responses. Maybe just a minute most from anybody who's willing to jump in. So we have remedial studies, and then also speaking about apprenticeships.
I'll respond to the first one quickly. So I'll sort of just endorse the statement that you were making, I think, implicitly with your question, and that's that we've maybe done a disservice to students and the country by putting too much emphasis on bachelor's degrees as the path to the American dream. And I don't have the answers for how do we undo that, but I think it's something that we need to spend more time talking about. I think we could have a whole another panel on remedial education and developmental education, so I won't necessarily say too much about that because I don't think we have time other than to say it's an important topic that deserves conversation. On apprenticeships and degrees, I would say they're not mutually exclusive, and just a point of reference, more than half of the people that Peter Thiel funded ended up going back to college because they felt like they needed a bachelor's degree. So I want us to say that, we talk about all these alternative pathways, which I think are fantastic. We are doing everything that we can with our community colleges actually to ask them to offer apprenticeships. That's one of probably the second biggest initiative that we've done in New Jersey has been around apprenticeships. I don't think them and college are mutually exclusive terms. However, because we're looking at data and averages, like we know that on average, the more education you get, the more likely you are to get a higher return. And even though that is not the case for every single person, I would venture to guess that 75% of the people in this room have a bachelor's degree. And so the conversation about this, I just feel like sometimes can get very sticky very quickly when we talk about other people's children. So we should be very open to making sure that everybody understands the world of work and has good exposure to that, but also without kind of tripping into old things that say some people's kids deserve bachelor's degrees, especially my kids, and other people's kids can be exposed to lots of other things. And again, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, but I just think we have to be careful when we talk about it.
Just 1 minute. I don't want my grandkids or my nieces and nephews paying $20,000 for a truck driving school in 5 years when we're going to have driverless trucks. So I think we do need to get to the conversation about artificial intelligence and where these jobs are going to be and whether the students are going to be ready for those jobs as they change. And so that gets me to my just point on remediation. When we have so many large numbers of students needing remediation, we did publish Promise with a Purpose this spring, and it profiles the programs that are eliminating remediation or figuring out new designs for remediation, because bottom line, we don't want students using Pell Grants for remediation when we can do it in better ways. So I would just refer you to that to see, in Dallas County Promise, their goal is to eliminate remediation in the high schools. What about disconnected adults? We've got a remediation challenge. We've got to find much better ways to get students moving through so that they are prepared to do well in college and career.
Okay, Robert and Doug, last thoughts?
I think that states are going to try to push individual colleges to pay for remediation, and colleges are going to either try to push students or high schools to pay for it. Because it's something that, at least for some people, is necessary, but no one wants to pay for it. And I can't really speak to artificial intelligence. Natural intelligence is struggle enough.
So I'm just going to use my last minute to thank everybody, thank the panel for participating. I think it's been a really rich conversation. Thank my research team again, funders, Brookings, the audience, everybody online, because I think this has been a great conversation, and look forward to continuing that.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here and for your participation.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.